Hi, everyone. My name is Parker Ramsey, and I'm the president of the Federalist Society student chapter at Rutgers Law School in Newark. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to SOC Sidebar, brought to you by the Federalist Society Student Division and the Federalist Society at Rutgers Law School Newark. So each month, the student division and rotating student chapter host a Zoom series called SOC Sidebar, featuring a judge being interviewed by a student chapter president about the judge's passion, hobby, or interest, and how it interrelates with the law. Our sixth SOC sidebar features Judge John Nalbandian, who will discuss whiskey and cigars. John Nalbandian serves as a United States Circuit Judge from Kentucky on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. He was nominated and confirmed to that position in 2018. Prior to that, Judge Nalbandian was a partner in the litigation practice group of Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister in Cincinnati, where he served as the firm's lead appellate lawyer and also practiced complex litigation in state and federal courts. At the end of this evening's interview, we will open the floor to questions from the audience. You must be logged in as a participant in the Zoom webinar in order to ask a question. Please use the Zoom Q&A feature to submit your questions. When we get your question, I will read it aloud and address it during the session. Without further ado, Judge, where did your appreciation for whiskey and cigars originate?
Well, thanks, Parker, and thank you all for inviting me. I know the last session was on physical fitness from Judge Van Dyke, and obviously we're not going to cover that today. Anyway, so the I would say probably in college, with cheaper cigars and cheaper whiskey than I'm used to today. My dad, who was a professor, and he's emeritus now, but he smoked some cigars. Although I remember mostly he smoked a pipe, as most professors do. But yeah, so yeah, college, I would say not a connoisseur, but certainly that was my entry level.
Absolutely. So there are many varieties of whiskey: Scotch, Irish whiskey, bourbon, Japanese whiskey. So which is your go-to now that your tastes have refined?
Well, I mean, look, I'm from Kentucky, so so it has to be bourbon.
Yeah.
Um, so not all bourbon actually has to be made in Kentucky. It actually just has to be made in the US, but obviously the best bourbon comes from Kentucky. And they say it's because of the limestone water, which is why the racehorses are also better when they're from Kentucky. So it's bourbon and racehorses. Um, but bourbon, it's interesting because I think people don't know that bourbon is defined by federal law. It's actually in the Code of Federal Regulations. I actually brought a prop. This is the CFR volume. I don't know if you can see it, but
Yep.
yeah, no, it's got the federal standards of identity that define bourbon, and it has to be from the US, just like, Scotch has to be from Scotland. But yeah, so bourbon is my number one go-to, although I like a good Scotch now and then, or maybe a JMO or a Suntory Japanese whiskey. But yeah, definitely bourbon.
Okay. So let's talk bourbon a little bit. What is your favorite bottle within that category?
Yeah, so yeah, bourbon. It's interesting because they're basically I define bourbons like they're the bottles that you can get and the bottles that you can't get at a reasonable price. So my absolute favorite bottle that is hard to find is George T. Stagg, which is from Buffalo Trace. They They're the distiller of the Pappy Van Winkles that people know. Um, Stag is um, has a has a rye content. So I don't know if people know about bourbon. Obviously, there's a grain mash bill that you distill into the bourbon, and it's got to be 51% corn. That's part of what's in the CFR. But beyond that, it's malted barley and then either rye or wheat. And the Pappy Van Winkles are famous. They're wheated bourbons, and so they're smoother. The Stag that I like is has got rye in it, so it's a it's a I would say it's an oakier taste, I guess. Some people would say it's kind of an ethanol taste because it's got a very high alcohol content. But in terms of like the bourbons that you can get, I like a Woodford Reserve,
Mm.
Maker's Mark, um, Weller Special Reserve, which is a green label Weller that's also a wheated bourbon. Those are kind of my favorites.
Yeah, the Woodford Reserve. For me, would that's always my go-to for bourbons. I tend to err on the side of Scotches and Irishes, but when I
Okay.
drink bourbon, it's Woodford for sure.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a higher rye content bourbon, definitely. It's a
Yeah.
little, although it's a little fruitier, I would say. I mean,
Hmm.
the thing about cigars and bourbon is there are, the connoisseurs will tell you, they'll tell you like the hints, the notes. It's kind of like drinking wine. I
Right.
taste cinnamon or honey or citrus or vanilla, oak, whatever it is. Um, and if you kind of sit down and really want to do a tasting, I think you can get some of those notes. But for me, it's you know, I like what I like, so I can taste some of that. But for example, the Weller Green Label I think has a very kind of vanilla um, taste that you get out of it. But most most bourbons, it's I just really it's the oakiness. That has to be aged in new charred oak barrels, so that's where the flavor comes from, and also the color. When bourbon goes into the barrel, it's clear. It's basically just moonshine, and then
Right.
as it ages, it picks up the notes and also the color.
So, on that note, so whiskey is aged in barrels, often ones that were used to distill other spirits, infusing it with notes of that spirit's flavor. Do you think stare decisis creates a similar effect on our common law, infusing new decisions with the spirit of previous ones?
Uh, that's an interesting question. Um, I actually think it might be the opposite. If you if
Interesting.
you if you think that the law kind of continues to develop, kind of the newer decisions infuse a flavor into the old ones, but um, judicial conservatives, I think, obviously we tend to be more formal. And so we think that judges kind of infusing the law with new values or their own values kind of goes beyond the proper judicial role. Much like, I guess, a whiskey purist might believe that infusing traditional bourbons or scotches with new spirits is an
Right.
abomination.
Yeah.
So I mean, maybe I would phrase it that way, but I don't
Yeah.
know.
Absolutely. No, I think that's really insightful. So, uh, all right, you're relaxing with a glass of you said it was
George T. Stagg.
George T. Stagg after finishing the final draft of an opinion. So, what kind of cigar Are you smoking with it?
Um, so yeah, so cigars are kind of like whiskey in the sense that, um, obviously I talked about kind of the broad like flavor profiles that you get from tobaccos. Um, and also in the sense that there are um, cigars that are kind of easily obtainable and ones that are not. Um, the ones that are not obviously are the Cuban cigars that we can't buy in the U.S. You can get them overseas. So whenever I go to London, I tend to smoke Cuban cigars, and at various times you've been able to kind of bring some back to the US. But in terms of like what you can get, I tend to like a stronger cigar, kind of a full bodied cigar. So the My Father Cigar Company it's actually makes a cigar called the Judge, interestingly enough, that I enjoy.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
familiar with that one. Yeah.
okay, yeah, so that's a good one. The Liga Privada #9 by Drew Estates, um,
Yes. Okay.
Ashton BSGs
Hmm.
are great cigars. It varies for me, but I tend to like a fuller bodied cigar.
Yeah. My father, Le Bijou, was my favorite from there.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
so Um, Tobacco from most cigars is grown, as you mentioned, in a limited number of countries like Cuba. Nicaragua and Dominican Republic are some other really prolific producers. And each of them, again, connoisseurs tend to ascribe different flavor profiles with each of these countries. It sounds like you may err toward Cuba. Do you have any other particular countries that you enjoy the cigars from? I'm a Nicaragua man myself.
yeah. So, a cigar, there's kind of three components to a cigar, right? There's
Hmm.
the wrapper, there's the the binder, and there's the filler. So the filler is kind of what you like is the bulk of a cigar. The binder is kind of the leaf that holds it together, and then the wrapper kind of is obviously goes on the outside as what you see. And the flavor of a cigar, a lot of it actually comes from the wrapper, which you wouldn't necessarily think because it's not the bulk of the cigar. Um, but I like so the fuller bodied cigar, like the My Father the Judge, the binder. I think the binder and the filler are Nicaraguan, and
Mm-hmm.
the wrapper is Sumatran, which is Indonesian seed, but it actually is Ecuadorian. So they grow it in Ecuador. Um, the Liga Privada is has a Connecticut wrapper that's a dark wrapper, um, and it's got a Brazilian binder. So but the darker full body tobaccos like Nicaraguan tobacco for sure, and the Sumatran. Yeah, that's kind of what I tend toward. And the flavor profiles you get, um, like leather sometimes,
Hmm.
some cedar, chocolate. Um, it's one of those things like if you're in a group and you say, oh, I taste chocolate, and everybody's like, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. But you have to kind of pay attention, and it's oftentimes it's just a contrast. So like a whiskey tasting, you'll taste like three or four different ones, and then you start to kind of discern the differences. And cigars, like you can do a cigar tasting where you know, have a few different varieties, and I think you start to taste a little bit of the difference.
Yeah, I would say that that's my experience as well. I like you. I started out my familiarity with cigars and whiskey in college, and that my taste was very cheap. I was like, I think I was smoking Maker's Mark cigars, which it doesn't even make any sense. But
Well, it's
but
better than a Swisher Sweet, but yeah, you know.
yeah. Well, God forbid. No. So I can definitely relate. The I think that it's like anything. It's like studying the law. The more familiar you grow with just doctrines, with the sort of basics, um, the more you can detect the nuances between different, individual cigars or whiskeys.
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely. Yeah.
So, cigar aficionados, they will often preserve their smoking collection in humidors to enjoy on special occasions. Judges will similarly do this by noting issues in their holdings to be taken up at a later date. Thinking of the Students for Fair Admissions decision, uh, Judge Robert or Justice Roberts noting that military academies may have a different application for a similar rule. Are there any issues that you look forward to seeing how they are decided, either by the Sixth Circuit or by the Supreme Court?
Uh, yeah, no, that's an interesting question. Certainly, like the Supreme Court's been kind of revisiting a lot of administrative law decisions, and I think one of the main ones that's kind of been left open is the non-delegation doctrine, and certainly they've got a case this term that presents that issue. And I wrote a dissent on a panel opinion about the non-delegation doctrine, so I'm curious to see how that one ends up. Um, Qualified immunity, I know we've talked a lot about that kind of in the conservative legal movement, um, kind of a did two wrongs make a right situation. And I know the courts kind of danced around that one. And I think it'll be interesting to see kind of where we end up there. But I think there are a lot of things that are out there, that I'm curious about, how it's gonna, how the story's gonna end. Although it's the law, so I don't know if the story ever ends, right?
I think that that's fair to say that the end is certainly not perceivable anytime soon. Are there any cases on the books that you just want to douse with whiskey and throw a lit cigar on?
Now you're trying to get me into trouble.
Never. Absolutely not.
No, I think, well, look, I'll tell you what. Um, I think my own work. So my own work, I don't, I wouldn't say I want to take a flame to it. But I'm always kind of just examining what I've done. And I sometimes dread like reading some of my old opinions just because there are always things that you wish you could have done or could have done better. So I wouldn't tear them down, but you might want to revisit. It reminds me a little bit of when I was a lawyer, and I used to, I was an appellate practitioner. So, you would do the briefing in a case, and then um, the oral argument would come, months later, and you'd go back through, and the first thing I would do is read the briefs again, right? Hey, what was this case about? And invariably, I'd read my brief and say, oh my gosh, what was I doing? Or I wish I had argued this, or maybe I should have made another point. And again, I wouldn't take a torch to it, but there's definitely around the edges, maybe a little touch up, as we say, with your torch on a cigar where a little part of
Right.
it's unlit. You want
Yeah,
to light it and touch it up a little. I would definitely touch up some things for sure.
that's fair. That's fair. Um, so taking a step back from the law for a moment, what is your fondest memory of enjoying whiskey and a cigar?
Oh man. I don't know if there's one memory. I mean, uh I was
Well,
back at
you can.
UVA this I was back at UVA this fall, and my son and I went out. He's at 1L at UVA, and we went out and had a cigar and an Eagle Rare at one of the old bars I used to go to in Charlottesville. That was nice, but no, it's nothing really that specific. The great thing I've noticed, by the way, about enjoying a cigar and whiskey is that you meet all kinds of people. Like
Mhm.
some of my best friends I've met kind of through like cigar smoking. You meet kind of people from like all walks of life. Um, and I think, lawyers, especially younger lawyers, like you need to kind of keep a perspective and kind of broaden your horizon a little bit. It's always nice to talk to people who aren't lawyers, although invariably lawyers talk about the law. Uh, but cigar smoking is for sure is kind of a, I mean, for sure it's kind of a predominantly male thing, I will say, but um, definitely across kind of the society, you'll find cigar smokers, and that's definitely something I enjoy.
Yeah. If you could choose any person from any time in history with whom to share a drink and a smoke, who would you choose?
Well, I mean, it's a FedSoc, right? It's got to be James Madison. So,
That's
it's
fair.
funny, but I did a talk at the first we did a cigar event at the National Lawyers Convention a couple years ago, the inaugural one that I spoke at. And I spoke about James Madison, and he was a cigar smoker from what we can tell. So that would fit in. And my understanding is he also drank whiskey. So it would fit. And we could
Yeah, it's a
talk
good
about
fit.
exactly. And we could talk about originalism or something, So definitely James Madison. That's the right answer on that one.
Oh, that's great. Wow. That's I'm glad that the archaeological research is really aligned with what we want it to be. You know? So we've got a couple of questions from our online audience. First one is coming from Richard Barnett. He asks, do you think that some of the mystique about Cubans is our inability to get them, or do you think a Cuban is actually that much better?
um, that's a great question, and it's a debate that I have had with my fellow cigar smokers. So definitely the rarity, there is definitely a mistake. And, the revisionism is um, there are Nicaraguan cigars that are just as good, and Cuba is overrated because the soil's been overworked and whatever. But I'm kind of a counter revisionist on that. I actually think the Cuban cigars are really good. Um, it's a different flavor profile. You've got to kind of taste it. There were people the first time that when I got into cigar smoking, people would say that Cuban cigars are stronger, but I don't think that's true. I think it's just a different kind of flavor profile. Um, and you've got to kind of taste them to figure it out. My favorite Cuban is probably a Partagas Serie D,
Mm.
although the Monte Cristo #2 is a classic Cuban cigar. That's a great cigar, and kind of a, if you're not into, it's more of a medium body, I would say, but I think the flavor is great. The prices are outrageous. Even when you go, if you go to London, you've got to sock away some money if you're going to smoke. But the London is great. The shop that Winston Churchill used to get his cigars from is still around, still in
Yeah,
business.
Fox.
Yep,
Yeah,
James
yeah, it's
Fox.
great.
And you can go there on the second floor and smoke a Cuban cigar. And so yeah, no, I like the Cubans. Obviously they're great non-Cuban cigars, and I kind of like them both, but yeah, I still think there's something to the Cuban cigars.
So a couple of things about what you just said. So if you do go back to Fox, your dad might like there is really good pipe tobacco that Fox sells,
Yeah.
and might be a little easier to get back into the United States than the Cuban cigar.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I heard an interview with Michael Jordan. Apparently, Michael Jordan's favorite cigar is the Partagas Lusitania.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we got similar tastes there. We've got another question from the audience. This one comes from Ann Kreuscher. She asks, "Are there any good starter whiskeys and cigars that the judge would recommend to newbies?" So we might be recruiting a one into the ranks of cigar smokers and whiskey drinkers.
um, Starter whiskey. So I would look for a bourbon that's 80 proof. Okay, so like the the George T. Stagg that I like is barrel proof. It can be 120, 130 proof, which is really hot. Okay, that's 60 plus percent alcohol. 80 proof is 40%. That's doable for a beginner. I would definitely recommend. I actually think Maker's Mark is a good one. And I think that you should start maybe with some mixed drinks, like an old fashioned or a Manhattan, that kind of, you know, as opposed to drinking it straight, that someone might enjoy. So like a Maker's Mark Manhattan is a great drink. And something you can make easily at home, or any bar you can get it. Cigars, kind of similar. I would recommend kind of a milder cigar with a Connecticut wrapper, maybe an Ashton, like an Ashton Corona, Ashton Magnum. The lighter wrapper tends to
Yeah.
be a more manageable cigar. Um, sometimes people recommend like the flavored cigars, which I'm just not a fan of.
No.
Uh, so I would go with a traditional, but definitely like the Ashton. Um, the Camacho is another one that's kind of a lighter um, taste. So, yeah.
Uh, some of uh, some of my family members are not cigar smokers, and I wanted to get some cigars that we could use to celebrate my wedding over the summer. And we got a recommendation for these. Don't know if you can see Buenaventura's, and it is also a nice Connecticut wrapper, very mild, but everybody loved them. Cigar smokers and non-cigar smokers alike. So any starter smoker, any starter smoke like the Ashton VSG that you had mentioned, like there's so many really good ones.
Yeah.
So last question that we've got from the audience. Oh, Okay, so we got one more, but punch cut, V cut, or straight cut for your cigars, Judge?
I tend to go with a straight cut. It's, it's a little more smoke, you know.
Yeah.
But it varies. But that's the pretty traditional cut. And you know, I'll enjoy a V cut every so often, but for me, yeah, mostly it's a straight cut. You got to get
Okay.
a good sharp cutter though, otherwise you can kind of mangle the cap. The end you cut is called the cap, and you can kind of mangle it a little bit if you don't have a sharp cutter.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. We've got a couple more. You mentioned mixed drinks. Do you have any other favorite mixed drinks that do not include whiskey?
Oh, do not include whiskey.
I know.
Um,
Sorry to even ask that.
I like a Negroni, although you can make a Negroni with bourbon, and it's called a Boulevardier. That's a great drink. The last word cocktail. I like older cocktails, like a Corpse Survivor #2 or a last word. Some gin drinks maybe, um, for sure. But I like going to kind of a craft cocktail bar. We've got some great ones in Cincinnati, and it's not just about the bourbon necessarily, but yeah, um, I like cocktails with egg white. It makes it smooth, and I think, but yeah, I mean, I'm a like equal opportunity spirits consumer.
Like, absolutely. So, um, we've got. We spoke earlier about flavored cigars, but we didn't touch on this sort of age old tradition. Do you ever dip your cigar in whiskey or cognac?
I don't. Uh, yeah, I never really gotten into that. Um, I do. I will drink like a bourbon or a wine maybe with a cigar, and you can get into all kinds of like pairings. What's better, but I like a cigar with a cup of coffee. It's
Yeah,
not. It doesn't have to be an alcoholic beverage. Like there are certain kind of flavors that kind of mix, like an espresso and a cigar. Like that can be a good combination. Uh,
absolutely.
yeah.
Do you prefer cigars as more of a social experience or more just like a meditative experience?
It can be both. And I like this. I like to smoke a cigar and do some work. Get through editing an opinion, or um, I've got a lot of administrative stuff that we have to take care of. um, that's nice with a cigar. uh, a spoonful of sugar, right? Um, so it's that kind of experience, but also, like I said before, there is a social aspect. Going to a cigar shop in a different, like if I'm traveling or on the road, I might find a cigar shop, stop in, and have a smoke, and sometimes you'll talk to some people that are there, or not. Cigar smokers tend to be pretty like friendly, like they're, and I think it's kind of beginner friendly. Like I think if you don't know what you're doing and you go into a good tobacco shop, they'll help you out and try to guide you and introduce you to whatever it is and tell you about the ritual of like cutting and lighting and all of that. Um, and so yeah, the social aspect of it is a great part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so I think that brings our Q&A period to a close, Judge. I do want to note. Looks like one of our guests, Matthew Arnold, let us know that he poured a snifter at the beginning of this conversation of 15-year-old Bowmore, single malt. Um, so anyone out in the audience, if you want to give that a shot, you're more than welcome. But
An interactive
um,
event, yeah.
yeah,
I'm sorry I did. Well, I'm in my chambers right now, so the smoking is out for sure. Uh, I do keep my quirks will tell you there are some bourbons in the office and um definitely like um if you do something special in my chambers you earn a shot of Blanton's. Blanton's is the reward in this chamber. So Blanton's is another one of those Buffalo Trace bourbons like the Pappy's and
yeah,
Eagle Rare and George T. Stagg and Weller. Um, Blanton's is kind of in I think it's the lower rye mash, but definitely a great bourbon and it's a good reward for sure.
absolutely. For all you would-be clerks out there, make note of that.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Yeah, beware if you ever get interviewed by me and I ask you whether you like bourbon or not, you might be and you say yes. The next question would be, well, do you want to have some? So just beware. There can be a bourbon test. Yeah.
well, thank you, Judge. I'm just going to let everybody know real quick. Next month's SOX sidebar will be held on March 18th. It's going to feature Judge Ben Beaton, who will discuss March Madness. You can register at fedsoc.org/sidebar-7. So, Judge, thank you so much for your time tonight. Cannot tell you how much we appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you, Parker, for hosting and thanks to the FedSoc for
No, it's
sure.
our pleasure.
Yeah,
Take
thank
care.
you. Good night.
Good night.